In the mid-18th century, the 13 colonies stretching along the Atlantic coast were a prosperous jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Generations had passed since the first settlers arrived, and the colonists considered themselves loyal subjects of King George III. They shared a common language, a common culture, and a deep-seated respect for the rights of Englishmen. But beneath this veneer of loyalty, a unique identity was slowly, inexorably beginning to form. An identity that would soon clash violently with the imperial power across the ocean. This is the story of how a quarrel over taxes escalated into a revolution, a war for independence, and the birth of a nation founded on a revolutionary idea that all men are created equal. The seeds of discontent were sown in the wake of the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War. Britain had triumphed, securing control of the entire continent east of the Mississippi. But victory came at a staggering cost. The national debt had soared, and Parliament in London felt it was only fair that the colonists, who had benefited most from the war's outcome, should bear some of the burden. It was a logical decision from London's perspective, yet it completely missed the evolving mindset of the American colonists. The first major offensive in this war of wills was the Stamp Act of 1765. This was not a tax on trade, but a direct tax on printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, requiring a special stamp. For the colonists, this wasn't just about money, it was about authority. They held that only their own colonial assemblies, in which they had direct representation, had the right to tax them. The rallying cry that echoed from Boston to Charleston was simple and profound. No taxation without representation. The response was immediate and fierce. Merchants boycotted British goods, legal proceedings ground to a halt, and extra-legal groups like the Sons of Liberty formed to enforce the boycotts and intimidate British officials. These were not polite protests. They were acts of defiance that included public effigies, tarring and feathering, and outright revolutionary fervor. The colonial response was so effective and unified that Parliament was forced to repeal the Stamp Act just 1 year later. But in doing so, they passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's absolute right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The fundamental issue remained unresolved. Tensions continued to mount. The Townshend Acts, imposing new duties on imports like tea, glass, and paper, reignited the protests. As the situation grew more volatile, Britain deployed troops to Boston, the epicenter of resistance, to maintain order. The presence of redcoats, reminders of imperial power, only served to heighten the friction. On a cold evening in March 1770, a small but deadly confrontation occurred. A crowd began harassing a British sentry, which quickly escalated into a chaotic scene. 5 colonists were killed, including Crispus Attucks, often cited as the first casualty of the Revolution. The event was immediately seized upon by colonial leaders like Paul Revere, who produced a sensationalized engraving depicting the event as a brutal, unprovoked massacre of innocents by tyrannical soldiers. This event, forever known as the Boston Massacre, became a potent propaganda tool, painting the British as oppressors and martyrs for the cause of liberty. The power of public narrative was beginning to shape the future. The seeds of discontent were sown in the wake of the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War. Britain had triumphed, securing control of the entire continent east of the Mississippi. But victory came at a staggering cost. The national debt had soared, and Parliament in London felt it was only fair that the colonists, who had benefited most from the war's outcome, should bear some of the burden. It was a logical decision from London's perspective, yet it completely missed the evolving mindset of the American colonists. They systematically dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, a massive and costly act of defiance. The Crown's response was swift and punitive. Parliament passed a series of laws the colonists dubbed the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, drastically restricting Massachusetts self-government, and allowing British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain. This was an attempt to isolate and punish Massachusetts, but the effect was the opposite. The Intolerable Acts galvanized the colonies. If the British could crush the rights of Massachusetts, they could crush the rights of any colony. In September 1774, 12 colonies, Georgia abstained, sent delegates to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They were not yet advocating for independence, but for a coordinated response to defend their traditional rights. They issued a Declaration of Rights and formed the Continental Association, agreeing to halt all trade with Britain until their grievances were addressed. This was a monumental step toward unified action. As diplomatic measures failed, both sides began preparing for the inevitable. Colonial militias, known as Minutemen, began stockpiling arms and drilling in their towns. The British governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, learned that the colonists were storing weapons in Concord. In April 1775, he dispatched a force of several hundred troops to seize the supplies and arrest revolutionary leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the alarm was raised. In the early morning hours of April 19, 1775, the British column encountered a small company of Minutemen on the village green in Lexington. No one knows for sure who fired the first shot, a confusion that has echoed through history. But that single discharge changed the world. It was the shot heard round the world. After a brief skirmish, the British continued to Concord, where a larger engagement erupted at the North Bridge. The American Revolution had begun. Within weeks, delegates from all 13 colonies convened the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. This body immediately began acting as a provisional national government, forming the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Washington, a respected veteran of the French and Indian War and a Virginian, provided the crucial Southern support necessary for a united front. Yet even after the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, many delegates still hoped for reconciliation, drafting the conciliatory Olive Branch Petition to the king. The king rejected the petition, declaring the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. Soon after, the bloody and costly Battle of Bunker Hill proved that the colonists were willing to fight and die for their cause. The tide of public opinion was being decisively turned by the powerful pen of Thomas Paine. His pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776, stripped away the mystique of the monarchy and argued in plain, forceful language for complete and immediate independence. Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies in a few months, persuading countless colonists that King George III was not their benevolent protector, but a tyrant. The momentum was unstoppable. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution to Congress, resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A committee was formed to draft a formal declaration to accompany the resolution, and the task fell primarily to a young, eloquent Virginian planter and scholar, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson drew upon the philosophical currents of the Enlightenment, particularly the writings of John Locke, articulating a radical new political philosophy. He didn't just list grievances against the king. He established a universal principle that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that people possess inherent, inalienable rights that cannot be taken away. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The debate in Congress was intense. The delegates wrestled with every phrase, particularly those dealing with slavery, a contradiction that would haunt the new nation for centuries. But the need for unity and the gravity of the moment prevailed. On July 2nd, 1776, the Congress officially voted to adopt Lee's resolution for independence. The 13 colonies were now, legally and officially, the United States of America. 2 days later, on July 4, 1776, after further revisions and edits, the Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. The ringing of the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia announced the momentous decision to the world. A new nation had been conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. This was more than a political breakup. It was a promise, a commitment to a set of ideals that would inspire democratic movements globally for generations to come. The delegates who affixed their names to that document did so knowing they were committing an act of high treason against the most powerful empire in the world. As Benjamin Franklin famously quipped, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." The signatures were a literal pledge. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They were signing their names to a war that was far from won. The Declaration was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of an arduous, bloody war that would last for another 7 years. The new republic would face staggering defeats, near collapse, and immense sacrifice. But what had fundamentally changed was the reason for the fight. It was no longer a squabble over taxes. It was a fight to realize the self-evident truths articulated in Philadelphia. The legacy of the American Revolution is the legacy of that ideal. It gave the world the first sustained experiment in self-government based on Enlightenment principles. Though imperfectly executed at its inception, the contradiction of slavery being the most glaring failure, the Declaration of Independence created a permanent standard against which the nation would forever measure itself. It set America on a path of continuous striving toward a more perfect union. The dream, born in 1776, is the dream of a people determined to govern themselves, a dream that remains unbreakable.